San Francisco, June 1966, 3 a.m. Flames. The world's largest glass palace didn't just burn, it was erased. Most people call it a tragedy. But when you examine the evidence, you see something different. A crime scene. A $2 million insurance grift. When you stand today at Land's End, near the Cliff House restaurant, you see nothing but broken concrete and fog. Rusted metal frames jut from the rocks like broken ribs. Moss-covered staircases led nowhere. The Pacific Ocean crashes against stone foundations that once supported something impossible. 3 acres of glass and iron arches. 7 swimming pools holding over 600,000 gallons of seawater. A secret museum filled with Egyptian mummies and stolen artifacts. All of it gone. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books. This wasn't just the story of a building. It was the physical manifestation of one man's obsession to control the Pacific Ocean itself. Adolf Sutro, a mining engineer who conquered darkness underground, built this monument because he couldn't conquer the tide. And 70 years after his death, someone made sure his dream would never rise again. When you walk through those ruins today, you're not a tourist admiring decay. You're standing in an active crime scene. Because behind those shimmering glass walls lay 6,000 gallons per minute of saltwater machinery, the hands of Irish miners who blasted tunnels through solid rock, and a 1966 fire that burned just a little too conveniently for the real estate developers circling this coastline like sharks. The question isn't how something so massive disappeared. The question is, who wanted it gone? And if you know where to look, the evidence is still there. Waiting in concrete, preserved in iron, hidden in university archives. You just have to be willing to investigate instead of romanticize. But before you can solve a crime, you need to understand the criminal's motive. And Sutro's motive was born 2,000 miles away, deep underground in the Nevada silver mines. If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture, the hidden machinery behind America's grandest buildings, and the untold stories of the workers who built them, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know. Now, back to our crime scene. To understand why someone would burn down a glass palace, we need to understand the man who built it. And Adolf Sutro's obsession began not in San Francisco, but 2,000 miles away in the darkness. Nevada, 1860. Darkness. Adolf Sutro descended into the Comstock Lode, one of the richest silver deposits in American history, and he saw men dying. Not from cave-ins, not from explosions, from something worse. Slow suffocation in tunnels filled with poisonous gas and scalding water that gushed from the depths at 170 degrees Fahrenheit. He was 29 years old, a German immigrant who'd arrived in San Francisco a decade earlier during the gold rush. But unlike the dreamers chasing surface gold with pans and prayers, Sutro had studied mining engineering in Prussia. He understood ventilation systems, water drainage, and the mathematics of structural collapse. He looked at the Comstock mines and saw a solvable problem. Others saw a death sentence. The deeper the miners dug, the hotter it became. At 600 feet below the surface, the rock itself radiated heat. Men worked in teams of 15 minutes, stripped nearly naked, drenched in sweat and mine water. When they climbed out, other men took their place. The mortality rate was astronomical. The profit margin was acceptable, at least to the mine owners. Sutro proposed something audacious, a horizontal drainage tunnel, 4 miles long, cutting through solid granite from the Carson Valley straight into the heart of the Comstock at 600 feet depth. It would drain the scalding water, ventilate the deadly gases, give miners a fighting chance. The mine owners laughed at him. The cost estimates were insane. $3 million, roughly $90 million in today's money. The technical challenges were impossible. And besides, dead miners were cheaper than engineering miracles. Then came 1869. April 7th, the Yellow Jacket Mine, an underground fire. 35 men trapped below. The ventilation system, such as it was, funneled smoke directly into the escape routes. Rescuers heard screaming from the shafts. They couldn't reach them. The men suffocated in the darkness, pounding on stone that wouldn't break. Suddenly, Sutro's tunnel didn't seem so impossible. He formed the Sutro Tunnel Company. Sold shares to miners, not mine owners, the workers understood. This wasn't about profit, this was about survival. Construction began in 1869. It took 9 years. 9 years of blasting through granite with black powder and hand drills. 9 years of cave-ins, floods, and financial collapse. Sutro mortgaged everything. His reputation, his fortune, his sanity. In 1878, they broke through. The Sutro Tunnel stretched 3,600 feet horizontally into the mountain, intersecting the Comstock lode at precisely the depth Sutro had calculated a decade earlier. Water that had killed dozens of miners now drained harmlessly into the Carson River. Fresh air flowed through the mines. The death rate dropped. Sutro became wealthy beyond measure. And more importantly, he became obsessed. Because here's what the history books miss. The tunnel wasn't just an engineering triumph. It was a psychological compulsion. Sutro had conquered darkness. He had bent stone and water to his will, through mathematics and stubbornness. He had controlled the uncontrollable. And now he had a problem. He mastered darkness underground because he couldn't control the light above. He conquered water in tunnels because he feared the ocean's chaos. Every success fed the hunger. Every triumph demanded a larger stage. The tunnel made him rich, but it didn't make him satisfied. He returned to San Francisco in the 1880s and bought land, lots of land. Estimates suggest he eventually owned 1/12 of the entire city. But property wasn't enough. Gardens weren't enough. Even rebuilding the Cliff House restaurant after a fire wasn't enough. He needed to build something impossible, something that would force nature itself to acknowledge his engineering genius. And when he looked down from the cliffs above Land's End and saw the Pacific Ocean smashing against the rocks in that wild cove, he finally found his enemy. Most men saw an unbuildable sight. Sutro saw a challenge. He would build a glass palace where ocean and architecture met. He would control the tide itself. And deep in his mind, in the part shaped by 9 years of suffocating darkness, he believed that if he could master the Pacific, he could finally rest. He was wrong, but before the glass palace could rise, Sutro needed to solve a problem no architect in America had ever faced: how to harness 6,000 gallons of seawater per minute without destroying the building from the inside. And for that, he would need the hands of men who understood rock the way he did. San Francisco, 1890. The cove below the Cliff House looked like a war zone. Blasting powder, hand drills, and 23 Irish immigrants with mining experience who answered an advertisement promising $2 a day. They would get half that. Their names don't appear in any official record of the Sutro Baths, but we know some of them. Patrick Reardon, 42, formerly of the Comstock. James Corrigan, 37, who'd lost 3 fingers in a Nevada cave-in. Michael Brennan, 19, who'd never been underground but needed work more than he needed safety. Sutro hired them because they understood rock, not the decorative stone used for mansions, but the volcanic substrate that formed San Francisco's coastline. Tough, fractured, soaked in salt water, and utterly unpredictable. The kind of rock that could collapse a tunnel or crack a foundation if you didn't respect it. Their first task was carving the intake tunnels. Sutro's design required seawater to flow into the building naturally during high tide. But the Pacific didn't cooperate on anyone's schedule. So Sutro designed a series of underground passages blasted directly into Rock Point that would channel the tide into holding chambers beneath the pools. When the tide dropped too low, massive pumps would take over, moving 6,000 gallons per minute through iron pipes. It was the Comstock Tunnel all over again, except this time he was building toward the ocean instead of away from it. The Irish workers spent 8 months in those tunnels, working by lantern light, breathing rock dust and salt water mist, drilling holes for black powder charges, then scrambling back before the blast. One mistake, and the ocean could flood the passage, drowning everyone inside. 2 men were injured seriously enough to quit. The others kept working. They needed the money. Their wages? $1 per day. Sutro had quietly revised the original offer. When Riordan complained, Sutro's foreman told him he was welcome to leave. There were plenty of desperate men in San Francisco. So they drilled, and blasted, and hauled debris in handcarts through passages so narrow they had to crawl. By 1891, the tunnel system was complete. 200 feet of carved rock channels, lined with concrete to prevent erosion, connecting the Pacific Ocean to the pools above. But the tunnels were only half the machine. The pools themselves required structural support that defied conventional engineering. Sutro couldn't simply pour concrete and hope. The foundation had to withstand constant water pressure, saltwater corrosion, and the Pacific's winter storms. So he brought in quarry stone from a site near what is now Sutro Heights. Massive limestone blocks, each weighing over 500 pounds. The workers built a rail system, not for tourists, for hauling rock. They laid tracks through the same cave you can hike through today at Land's End, running carts loaded with limestone from the quarry to the construction site. Day after day. Hundreds of tons. And then came the glass. This wasn't window glass. This was engineered glazing, custom manufactured in Pittsburgh, specifically for Sutro's design. Each pane measured roughly 4 feet by 8 feet, tempered to withstand wind pressure and temperature fluctuations. The total glass surface area exceeded 100,000 square feet. It was the largest glass-roofed structure in the Western Hemisphere. But someone had to install it, at height, in wind, above concrete floors. The glaziers were German immigrants, specialists recruited from Philadelphia, where they'd worked on train station roofs. Their leader, Wilhelm Haas, kept a ledger. We know from his notes that the crew consisted of 12 men, working 6 days a week for 18 months. They were paid $3 per day, significantly more than the Irish miners, because skilled glaziers could demand better wages. Haas noted the deaths. 2 men fell from the scaffolding. One survived with a shattered pelvis. The other died on impact. Sutro attended neither funeral. He was focused on the pump system. The pumps were British-made, 4 turbine units, each capable of moving 500 gallons per minute, installed in chambers below the main floor. These weren't decorative. They were survival. Without them, the pools would drain during low tide, turning Sutro's palace into a glorified concrete pit. The pump operators were hired after construction finished, 3 men per shift, 8-hour days, 75 cents per hour. Their job was to monitor water levels, adjust valve pressure, and keep the turbines running. If they failed, 500,000 gallons of seawater would drain into the Pacific in under 6 hours. By March 1896, the machine was complete. 200 feet of intake tunnels, 4 industrial turbines, 7 interconnected pools holding 1.8 million gallons of filtered seawater, 65,000 square feet of glass roof supported by iron arches. And beneath it all, a maze of pipes, valves, and drainage channels that Sutro himself had designed. It was the same obsession that built the Comstock Tunnel. Control water, control darkness, control nature through engineering. The Irish workers who carved the tunnels, most returned to Nevada. Patrick Riordan died of silicosis in 1902. The glaziers moved on to other projects. Wilhelm Haas's ledger ended in 1897. the year after the baths opened. Sutro never mentioned them by name in any speech or interview. As far as he was concerned, he had built this palace. The workers were just tools, replaceable, forgettable tools. But without them, his dream would still be a blueprint. And now, finally, the dream could open its doors. But what Sutro built wasn't just a swimming pool. It was a 3-acre monument to the idea that beauty and engineering could defeat the Pacific Ocean, at least for a while. March 14th, 1896. Morning light. The glass palace opened its doors, and 10,000 people arrived to witness something impossible. 3 acres of iron and glass stretched along the coastline like a crystal cathedral. The roof alone contained over 100,000 square feet of glazing, supported by massive arched trusses that curved overhead like the ribs of some enormous mechanical whale. When sunlight hit the structure at the right angle, the entire building shimmered. From Ocean Beach, it looked like a mirage rising from the rocks. But step inside, and the illusion became something heavier. 7 swimming pools descended in terraced levels toward the ocean, 6 filled with filtered seawater at different temperatures, ranging from cold Pacific chill to heated comfort. 1 freshwater pool for those who couldn't tolerate salt. The largest pool alone held 300,000 gallons, deeper than most people were tall, with springboards and high dive platforms that let swimmers plunge from heights that would terrify modern safety inspectors. The architecture wasn't decorative, it was functional paranoia. Every iron beam calculated to withstand wind shear from Pacific storms. Every glass pane tempered to flex without shattering when temperature shifted 40 degrees between morning fog and afternoon sun. The foundation driven into bedrock because anything less would crack under the constant percussion of waves hitting the breakwater. Sutro had designed this building the way he designed his tunnel, not for beauty, for control. The promenades that wrapped around the pools weren't just for viewing. They were elevated walkways that let Sutro's staff monitor water levels, pump pressure, and structural integrity from every angle. The balconies weren't romantic overlooks. They were observation platforms, where engineers could spot cracks in the glass or stress fractures in the ironwork before catastrophic failure. Because the Pacific was always testing him. Winter storms hit the breakwater with enough force to shake the building's frame. Salt spray corroded metal fixtures within months. The glass roof required constant maintenance, each broken pane replaced at significant cost. The pump system ran 24 hours a day, consuming coal and requiring 3-man crews per shift just to keep the pools full. This wasn't a swimming pool. It was a full-time engineering battle against entropy and ocean. And Sutro loved it. He had built a cage for the ocean. He had taken the wildest, most chaotic force in nature and confined it to 7 rectangular pools under a glass roof. Every day the pumps ran. Every day the pools stayed full. Every day the building didn't collapse was a personal victory over the Pacific. But here's what the opening day crowds didn't understand. This wasn't a monument to human achievement. It was a monument to one man's compulsion to prove that nature could be dominated through engineering. The same compulsion that made him spend 9 years digging through Nevada granite. The same obsession that made him mortgage everything for a tunnel that would save miners he'd never met. He wasn't building for the public, he was building against the ocean. And the ocean was patient. The breakwater would need repairs within 2 years. The glass roof would require partial replacement after the first major storm. The pump system would suffer repeated mechanical failures as salt water corroded the British-made turbines. By 1898, maintenance costs would exceed revenue. But on opening day, none of that mattered. 10,000 people walked through those doors and saw a glass palace. They swam in heated seawater. They rode the slides and swung from the trapezes. They believed for a few hours that they were inside something permanent. Sutro stood on the upper balcony and watched them, and for the first time in his life, he believed he had finally built something the ocean couldn't destroy. He was wrong. But the glass palace was more than just pools and pumps. Sutro had filled this building with something stranger, a museum of curiosities that would reveal just how deep his obsession with control actually ran. But if you examine the evidence carefully, you realize the swimming pools were only half the story. Sutro had traveled the world. Egypt, Europe, Mexico, the Far East. Everywhere he went, he collected. Not as a scholar, not as a curator, as a man who believed that if he owned an object, he controlled its meaning. And inside the Sutro Baths, on the second and third floors, he built a museum that revealed exactly how his mind worked. Egyptian mummies in glass cases, suits of medieval armor standing silent in rows, taxidermied animals in posed hunting scenes, ancient weapons, religious artifacts, manuscripts in languages Sutro couldn't read, and everywhere, signs that read, "From the private collection of Adolf Sutro," as if ownership was the same as understanding. The museum wasn't organized by culture or historical period. It was organized by Sutro's personal fascination. A Peruvian textile might sit next to a Chinese scroll next to a stuffed wolf. The connections existed only in Sutro's mind. Visitors walked through in confused wonder, trying to find meaning in the chaos. But here's where Sutro's philosophy becomes clear. The admission price for the entire complex, pools and museum combined, was 25 cents, roughly $8 in today's money. Affordable for working-class families. Factory workers could bring their children. Immigrants could swim in the same water as merchants and lawyers. This sounds generous. It wasn't. Sutro didn't believe in equality. He believed in access control. By setting the price low enough for the masses, but high enough to exclude the truly destitute, he created a space where he could watch society organize itself. The wealthy swam in the warmest pools. The workers used the cold ones. Everyone could see everyone else, but invisible boundaries remained. And the museum? That was his way of controlling history itself. Every artifact in those cases had been removed from its original context. The Egyptian mummies weren't in Egypt. The medieval armor wasn't in a castle. The religious manuscripts weren't in temples. Sutro had extracted them, transported them, and imprisoned them in glass cases above a swimming pool on the California coast. He didn't share beauty. He curated access to it. The exhibits changed based on his mood. Items appeared and disappeared without explanation. Some artifacts were authentic. Others were likely forgeries, but Sutro never admitted it. The museum existed because he wanted it to exist, organized by rules only he understood. It was the same philosophy that built the tunnel, the same obsession that built the glass palace. Control through engineering, control through ownership, control through the sheer force of will imposed on nature, history, and human society. But control has costs. The museum required guards, insurance, climate control in a building where humidity ranged from desert dry to tropical. Salt air corroded display cases. Moisture damaged textiles. By 1897, several mummies showed signs of deterioration. Sutro hired restoration specialists, then ignored their recommendations. The artifacts were his. He would decide how they were preserved. This wasn't generosity. This wasn't public education. This was a 70-year-old man proving to himself that he could own pieces of 5,000 years of human history and display them in a glass building at the edge of the Pacific Ocean. And the public loved it. Families paid their 25 cents and spent entire days inside. Children swam until exhausted, then wandered upstairs to stare at mummies and armor. Parents relaxed on benches, grateful for a space that felt luxurious without being exclusive. For a few hours, working-class San Franciscans could pretend they lived in a different world. Sutro watched from his private balcony and believed he had achieved something permanent. A glass palace. A museum of wonders. A controlled slice of ocean. A monument that would outlive him. He had 2 years left, because the one thing Sutro couldn't engineer was immortality. And when he died in 1898, the glass palace lost the only force holding it together, his obsessive, relentless will to control everything he touched. August 8, 1898. Sutro Heights. Adolf Sutro died in his mansion overlooking the Glass Palace. He was 68. Stroke. Quick. He never saw the 20th century, never saw automobiles replace cable cars, never saw his glass palace become obsolete, and crucially, he never established a succession plan that could maintain his vision. Because the baths weren't a business, they were an extension of Sutro's psychology, and when he died, the building lost its purpose. His estate was a disaster. He'd spent lavishly, the tunnel had made him wealthy, but the baths had consumed that wealth faster than anyone realized. Maintenance costs alone exceeded $50,000 annually, roughly $1.8 million in today's dollars. Revenue from admissions barely covered operating expenses. The museum cost a fortune to insure. The pump system required constant repairs. His heirs inherited a monument, not an asset. His daughter, Emma Sutro Merritt, took control initially. She understood that her father's creation was financially unsustainable, but she also understood that closing it would erase his legacy, so she tried to maintain it. Hired engineers to patch the glass roof, replaced corroded pump components, kept the admission price at 25 cents because that's what her father had demanded. But she wasn't an engineer. She wasn't obsessed with controlling the ocean. She was a woman trying to preserve her father's dream while watching it drain her inheritance. The evidence suggests the baths died the moment Sutro did. Not physically, but spiritually. The building was never designed to outlive its creator. It was designed to express him. Every pump, every glass pane, every artifact in the museum existed because Sutro willed it into existence. When his will disappeared, the building became just what it appeared to be, an expensive swimming pool with deteriorating infrastructure. The workers who'd built it were long gone. Patrick Reardon, dead of silicosis. Wilhelm Haas moved to Philadelphia. The pump operators who remained didn't understand Sutro's original vision. They kept the water flowing because that was their job, not because they shared his obsession. And the ocean kept testing the structure. Storms, salt spray, tidal pressure. Everything Sutro had fought against continued fighting back. But now there was no engineering genius making constant adjustments. By 1900, the breakwater showed serious cracks. The glass roof needed sections replaced after every winter. The pump system was failing more frequently. And the museum? Emma discovered that several artifacts were missing, either stolen or sold quietly to cover expenses. The Glass Palace was still standing, but it was already a ruin. It's one that still sold admission tickets. And now the real tragedy begins, because what comes next isn't a story of preservation. It's a story of slow financial strangulation, desperate reinventions, and the moment when someone decided the insurance payout was worth more than the history. The 1920s were unkind to glass palaces. By 1920, the Sutro Baths were losing approximately $30,000 annually, roughly $450,000 in today's money. Emma Sutro Merritt had died in 1938, passing control to her children, who understood art and society but not pumps and structural engineering. They hired managers. The managers hired staff. Nobody understood the building the way Adolf Sutro had. The Great Depression hit in 1929, and attendance collapsed. Working-class families who'd paid 25 cents to swim now couldn't afford bread. The admission price had risen to 50 cents by 1930, roughly $15 in modern terms. For many San Francisco families, that was a day's wages. The building kept demanding maintenance. The glass roof alone required $15,000 in annual repairs, about $280,000 today. Salt corrosion ate through iron beams faster than workers could replace them. The pump system, now 40 years old, suffered mechanical failures weekly. Each repair cost hundreds of dollars that the declining admission revenue couldn't cover. In 1934, the family tried reducing operating costs by closing 3 of the 7 pools. This cut heating expenses, but also cut capacity. Fewer pools meant fewer swimmers, Fewer swimmers meant less revenue. The spiral accelerated downward. The irony was brutal. The building had been designed for 10,000 visitors a day. Now it averaged 300. Those massive iron arches, the 100,000 square feet of glass, the tunnels carved through rock, the pump system moving thousands of gallons per minute, all of it still required the same maintenance whether 300 people came or 3,000. Fixed costs remained fixed. Revenue collapsed. By 1937, the Sutro heirs were considering closure. The structure was financially unsustainable, but closing meant admitting defeat. It meant acknowledging that Adolf Sutro's monument was a failure. Pride kept the doors open, even as debt accumulated. Then came World War II. Gas rationing, metal requisitions, labor shortages. The Pacific coast lived under blackout restrictions, and a glass palace visible from miles offshore was a security liability. The baths stayed open, but attendance plummeted. Young men who would have swum there were fighting in the Pacific. The families who'd brought children now brought worry instead. In 1942, the federal government briefly considered commandeering the structure for military training. They decided against it. Too expensive to maintain, too difficult to heat, too vulnerable to storms. After the war ended in 1945, attendance briefly recovered. Veterans returned. Families wanted normalcy. For a few years, the bath saw crowds again, though never matching the pre-depression numbers. But the structure itself was aging faster than anyone could repair it. The salt air had corroded critical support beams. The glass roof leaked in multiple sections. The concrete foundation showed stress cracks from decades of wave impact. The pump system required complete replacement, estimated at $200,000, roughly $2.8 million in modern terms. Nobody had that kind of money. In 1952, the Sutro family sold the property to Adolf G. Sutro, a grandson, for $250,000, about $2.9 million today. He immediately began removing the saltwater pools. Too expensive, too complicated. He replaced them with basketball courts and dance floors, and even trucked in sand to create an indoor beach. The transformation was desperate. Adolf G. Sutro was trying to save his grandfather's monument by erasing what made it special. No more ocean water. No more engineering miracle. Just cheap entertainment in an expensive building. It worked for a while. Attendance stabilized. But the fundamental problem remained. The structure was too large, too complex, and too expensive for any business model that didn't involve 10,000 daily visitors paying premium prices. The elite couldn't maintain what working-class hands had built, and the ocean kept testing every beam, every joint, every pane of glass, waiting for the moment when nobody could afford to fight back anymore. That moment came in 1952, when a businessman named George Whitney looked at the financial disaster and saw opportunity. Not in preserving Sutro's vision, in replacing it with something profitable, something cold, something that required far less maintenance than 1 million gallons of heated seawater. George Whitney was not a romantic. He was an accountant who owned amusement parks. When he purchased the Sutro Baths in 1952 for $250,000, roughly $2.9 million in today's money, he didn't see Adolf Sutro's monument to engineering. He saw square footage that could generate revenue without the catastrophic maintenance costs of saltwater pools and pump systems. His solution was simple. Brutal, but simple. Convert the remaining pools into an ice skating rink. The logic was sound. Ice rinks were booming in 1950s America. Post-war prosperity meant families had disposable income. Teenagers wanted date-night activities. And critically, maintaining ice required far less infrastructure than maintaining 7 saltwater pools heated to different temperatures. Whitney drained the pools permanently, shut down the pump system, removed the elaborate filtration equipment. He poured concrete over the lower pools and installed industrial refrigeration units designed for hockey rinks. The conversion cost $150,000, about $1.7 million today, still cheaper than 1 year of operating the pools as Sutro had designed them. The ice rink opened in 1954, and for a brief moment, it worked. Families came for weekend skating sessions. High school students arrived in groups, laughing and falling on the ice. Couples held hands and glided in circles, while organ music echoed through the enormous glass-roofed space. For people who remembered the pools, the transformation felt wrong. But for a new generation, the ice rink was simply what the Sutro Baths had always been. Whitney didn't care about the building's history, he cared about the profit margin, and for the first time since Adolf Sutro died, the structure was generating more revenue than it consumed in maintenance. Not much more, but enough to justify keeping it open. The museum collection, Whitney sold most of it. The Egyptian mummies went to universities. The medieval armor went to private collectors. The artifacts that had cost Sutro a fortune to acquire were liquidated to cover renovation costs. Whitney kept only the items with sentimental value to San Francisco locals. Everything else was inventory to be converted into cash. But even Whitney's practical approach couldn't defeat physics. The building was still too large. The glass roof still required constant repair. The iron beams still corroded in the salt air. And now, instead of seawater naturally flowing through tunnels, the structure required massive refrigeration units running 24 hours a day to keep the ice frozen. The electricity costs alone exceeded $20,000 annually, about $230,000 today. By 1960, Whitney was exhausted. He'd turned 76. The ice rink was profitable, but barely. Every winter storm required emergency repairs. Every summer heat wave required extra refrigeration. The building demanded constant attention, and he no longer had the energy. When George Whitney died in 1958, his family inherited a profitable headache. And unlike Whitney, they didn't have the sentimental attachment to Playland or the Cliff House or the Sutro Baths. They saw valuable coastal land locked up in an aging structure that generated modest returns. The real estate developers saw it too. By the early 1960s, San Francisco's coastline was exploding in value. Ocean Beach was being eyed for high-rise development. The Cliff House area was prime real estate, and the Sutro Baths, sitting on acres of coastal land with panoramic ocean views, could be worth millions if the building was gone. The Whitney family started taking meetings with developers. Proposals appeared for luxury condominiums, 12-story towers with floor-to-ceiling windows facing the Pacific, underground parking, retail space, modern conveniences, everything that 1960s America valued. The insurance policy on the Sutro Baths was $2 million, roughly $20 million in today's money. The estimated cost to demolish the structure safely? $400,000, about $4 million today. Complicated work. Structural engineers would need to dismantle the iron arches carefully, remove the glass without creating a hazard, fill in the tunnels, all while dealing with constant wave action and unpredictable coastal weather. Or someone could simply wait for an accident. Buildings this old catch fire all the time. Electrical problems, arson by vandals. Accidents happen. Follow the money, not the romance. By 1964, the ice rink was barely operating. The Whitney family had stopped investing in repairs. The glass roof leaked in a dozen places. The refrigeration units were failing. The building was becoming dangerous, and the city was starting to notice. Closure seemed inevitable. But demolition permits took time. Environmental reviews, historical assessments, public hearings. All of that bureaucracy delayed the profitable development the Whitney family was desperate to start. And then, on June 26, 1966, at approximately 3 a.m, someone solved the problem permanently. The fire started in the old office section. The wooden floor joists, the paper records, the perfect accelerant in a structure that had been neglected just long enough to make ignition easy and firefighting impossible. June 26, 1966, 3 a.m. Flames. The San Francisco Fire Department received the call at 3:47 a.m. By the time engines arrived at Land's End, the entire southern wing of the Sutro Baths was engulfed. The wooden floor joists, installed during Adolf Sutro's 1952 renovations, burned like kindling. The glass roof exploded from the heat. Iron beams twisted. Within 90 minutes, 70 years of history collapsed into smoldering concrete and twisted metal. The fire investigation began immediately. What they found wasn't mysterious, it was methodical. Point of origin: the administrative office section. Southern wall. Lower level. Accelerant detected: petroleum-based. Consistent with kerosene or gasoline. Multiple ignition sites. Forced entry: none. No signs of break-in. Whoever started the fire had either picked the lock professionally or possessed a key. Electrical malfunction: ruled out. The wiring in that section had been inspected 2 months prior and disconnected entirely. The building wasn't even drawing power from the grid that night. The San Francisco Fire Marshal's official report filed July 15, 1966, concluded arson, deliberately set, professional execution. Nobody was ever arrested. No suspects were ever publicly named, and the case was quietly transferred to the cold case archives within 18 months. But let's examine the evidence that wasn't in the official file. In March 1966, 3 months before the fire, the Whitney family had filed for demolition permits with the city. The permits were denied pending historical review. The San Francisco Historic Preservation Commission was considering landmark status for the structure. Landmark status would have prevented demolition indefinitely. In April 1966, the Whitney family's attorney met with representatives from 2 real estate development firms. Meeting minutes, discovered decades later in estate archives, show proposals for high-rise condominiums valued at $8 million, roughly $78 million in today's money. Development contingent on site clearance. In May 1966, the insurance policy on the Sutro Baths was renewed. $2 million coverage, fire, structural collapse, and acts of God. The premium had increased 40% from the previous year due to the structure's deteriorating condition and inadequate fire suppression systems. In June 1966, the building burned. In August 1966, the insurance claim was filed. The investigation took 6 months. The payout was approved in February 1967. Full coverage: $2 million, roughly $19 million in today's money. In November 1967, the Whitney family sold the land to developers for $750,000, about $7 million today. The developers never broke ground. The National Park Service intervened. This wasn't a tragic mystery. This was arson with a motive measured in millions. Nobody interviewed the night security guard who called in sick that evening. Nobody questioned why the fire suppression system had been temporarily offline for maintenance for 6 weeks. Nobody asked why the administrative section, which had been emptied of valuable records 3 days before the fire, was chosen as the ignition point. The San Francisco Chronicle called it the end of an era. Architectural historians mourned the loss of a Gilded Age masterpiece. But in the real estate offices downtown, the response was simpler. Problem solved. The glass palace that Adolf Sutro built to control the Pacific Ocean was erased by people who cared only about controlling the profit margin. The workers who'd carved tunnels through rock, the glaziers who'd installed 100,000 square feet of glass, the pump operators who'd kept the system running for decades, all of their labor reduced to insurance fraud. And the ocean, patient as always, began reclaiming what was left. Today, when you stand at Land's End and look at the ruins, you're not just seeing the remains of a building. You're seeing evidence. Evidence of obsession. Evidence of incompetence. Evidence of greed. And if you know where to look, you can still find pieces of the story that survived the flames. When you examine the evidence at Land's End today, You're standing in a crime scene that nature has been processing for 58 years. The developers who bought the land in 1967 never broke ground. The insurance money disappeared into the Whitney estate. The National Park Service intervened in 1980, designating the ruins as part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. Not because of their beauty, because of what they represented. Evidence of American ambition. Evidence of engineering hubris. Evidence of the moment when profit mattered more than preservation. The ruins attract 500,000 visitors annually. Most come for Instagram photos of broken concrete and crashing waves. They see romantic decay, picturesque erosion, nature reclaiming human ambition. But if you look closer, you see something different. Nature didn't erase the crime scene, it preserved it. Walk down the concrete pathways that Adolf Sutro's workers poured in 1895. The aggregate is still visible. The iron rebar, exposed by decades of saltwater erosion, shows the precise engineering calculations Sutro demanded. The tunnel entrances, now gated by the Park Service, still descend into the rock chambers, where Patrick Riordan and his crew blasted passages for the ocean to flow through. The pools themselves, those 7 rectangular depressions now filled with Pacific tidewater and green algae, still hold their shape. The concrete hasn't cracked, the foundations haven't shifted. Even after the 1906 earthquake, the 1989 Loma Prieta quake, and 58 years of storms, the structure Sutro's workers built remains geometrically perfect. That's not decay, that's testimony. Look at the iron arches that supported the glass roof, twisted by the 1966 fire into abstract sculptures, but examine them closely. The rivets are still intact. The joints show no signs of structural weakness before the fire. This wasn't a building that collapsed from age. This was a building that was murdered. But what about the artifacts? The mummies? The museum collection that Sutro spent decades accumulating? Follow the trail. In 1954, when George Whitney liquidated most of the museum, he sold approximately 60% to private collectors. Medieval armor went to a dealer in Los Angeles. Chinese scrolls went to a San Francisco art broker. Religious manuscripts were sold to the Huntington Library in Pasadena. All transactions documented in estate records discovered in 1998. The Egyptian mummies, however, were different. Whitney donated them to San Francisco State University in 1956, not out of generosity, tax deduction. The 4 mummies Sutro had acquired during his 1880s travels through Egypt were authenticated by SFSU's anthropology department and transferred to climate-controlled storage. They're still there. San Francisco State University's archives confirm the collection today. The mummies are cataloged as Sutro Collection, items 1432 to 1435. 2 adult males. 1 adult female. 1 child, approximately 6 years old. All dated to Egypt's 26th dynasty, roughly 600 BCE. Records show Sutro purchased them from a Cairo antiquities dealer named Hassan Ibrahim in 1887 for $2,000, about $68,000 in today's money. The mummies were never displayed at SFSU. Too fragile, too ethically complicated. Egyptian authorities have made multiple repatriation requests since 1980. The university is currently negotiating return terms. So Sutro's mummies survived, locked in a basement archive, never seen by the public he claimed to serve. Which, when you think about it, is exactly what he wanted. Not display. Possession. Control through ownership. Other artifacts survived in stranger ways. In 2003, a woman in Oakland donated a taxidermied snow leopard to the California Academy of Sciences. The tag read, Sutro Baths Museum, acquired 1892. It had been sitting in her grandmother's attic for 40 years. Her grandmother had been a cleaning supervisor at the baths and had rescued the leopard the week before the 1966 fire. Rescued, or looted, The line gets blurry when buildings burn under suspicious circumstances. In 2011, a man in Sacramento tried to sell a medieval helmet on eBay. The listing included a faded photograph showing the helmet in a glass case with a placard, "From the private collection of Adolf Sutro." The San Francisco Police Department's art theft unit seized it. It's now at the DeYoung Museum. The artifacts keep surfacing. Estate sales, storage units, attics. Pieces of Sutro's obsessive collecting scattered across California like shrapnel from an explosion. But the most important evidence isn't in museums. It's still at Land's End. The tunnels that Patrick Reardon's crew carved through solid rock, still there. The pump chambers that held the British turbines, still there. The concrete foundations that supported 1 million gallons of seawater, still there. The iron framework that held 100,000 square feet of glass, still there. What's missing is the glass, and the people who lit the fire. The National Park Service maintains the site now. They've installed interpretive plaques, historical photos, maps showing what once stood where visitors now take selfies. The plaques call it a monument to American ingenuity. They call Sutro a visionary. They call the fire a tragic loss. None of them call it what it was: arson with a $2 million motive. But if you know how to read the evidence, the ruins tell you everything. The char marks on the southern foundation, the twisted metal where the fire burned hottest, the administrative wing where the accelerant was poured. The Park Service preserved it all, unknowingly maintaining a crime scene for nearly 6 decades. And every day the Pacific Ocean continues the investigation. Each wave removes another layer of ash. Each tide exposes another detail. Nature isn't erasing the evidence. Nature is cleaning it, preparing it for those who know how to look. The glass palace is gone, but the truth remains, etched in concrete, twisted in iron, preserved by salt water and time. You just have to know where to look. So what does this investigation reveal? What do you learn when you treat history as evidence rather than nostalgia? When you follow the money instead of the romance? When you examine what was built, who built it, and why someone wanted it gone? When you started this investigation, you heard this called a crime scene. Now you understand why. But standing at the end, you realize it's more complicated than simple arson. The Sutro Baths were 3 crimes stacked on top of each other, separated by decades but connected by the same pattern: control, exploitation, erasure. Crime 1. Adolf Sutro. He didn't build the baths for San Francisco. He built them to defeat the Pacific Ocean. Every tunnel, every pump, every pane of glass was a weapon in his war against the tide. The building was never about public swimming. It was about proving that a man who'd conquered darkness in Nevada mines could conquer chaos on the California coast. He failed. The ocean tested his creation every day for 70 years, and when the building finally burned, the Pacific reclaimed the pools within hours. Nature always wins. Sutro just refused to believe it. But here's the part that matters. While Sutro was fighting his psychological battle against the ocean, real people were bleeding for his obsession. Patrick Reardon, James Corrigan, Michael Brennan. Irish immigrants promised $2 a day, paid half that, working in tunnels that could flood and drown them at any moment. Wilhelm Haas and his glaziers, 2 of whom fell to their deaths, installing glass that would shatter 40 years later. Sutro never mentioned their names. Not in speeches, not in interviews, not in his will. As far as he was concerned, he built the baths alone. The workers were just tools, replaceable, forgettable. That's crime 1. Using human labor as ammunition in a war against nature. Crime 2. The heirs and the grifters. After Sutro died in 1898, the building became a financial millstone. His daughter Emma tried to preserve it. His grandson Adolf G. tried to reinvent it. George Whitney tried to profit from it. All of them failed because none of them understood that the building was never designed to be sustainable. It was designed to express one man's obsession. But instead of admitting defeat, instead of acknowledging that the structure should have been demolished or donated to the city in the 1920s, when maintenance costs first exceeded revenue, the owners kept it running, cutting corners, deferring repairs, letting salt water corrode the support beams, allowing the glass roof to leak. By 1960, the Sutro Baths were a death trap. The city knew it, the Whitney family knew it, the insurance company knew it. But closing it meant losing the insurance payout, and the land underneath was worth millions to developers. So they waited. And when the fire started on June 26, 1966, nobody was surprised. Convenient doesn't begin to describe it. That's crime, too. Letting a historic structure decay into a fire hazard because the insurance money was worth more than the history. Crime 3, the erasure. This is the crime we're still committing. When you read about the Sutro Baths in history books, they call it a tragic loss. When tour guides bring visitors to Land's End, they talk about Sutro's generosity and the fire's mystery. The National Park Service plaques describe it as a, quote, monument to American ingenuity. None of them mention Patrick Reardon. None of them mention the wage theft. None of them mention the insurance policy or the real estate developers or the arson investigation that went nowhere. We've turned a crime scene into a tourist attraction. We've replaced investigation with nostalgia. We've chosen the comfortable story over the true one. That's crime 3. Forgetting the workers. Forgiving the grifters. Romanticizing the obsession. But here's what this investigation reveals. When you examine architecture as pathology instead of achievement, patterns emerge. Sutro built the tunnel because he feared suffocation in darkness. Then he built the baths because he feared chaos in nature. Both structures were attempts to control the uncontrollable. Both required workers to risk their lives for his psychological comfort. Both ultimately failed. The tunnel still exists, but the mines it served are closed. The baths are ruins, and Sutro's name is attached to both, which is exactly what he wanted. Immortality through architecture. But immortality has a cost, and the people who paid it deserve to be remembered too. So, when you visit Land's End, when you stand at the ruins and take your photos, remember this. The concrete beneath your feet was poured by men whose names aren't on any plaque. The iron you're photographing was installed by workers who fell to their deaths. The tunnels beneath your feet were carved by Irish immigrants paid half what they were promised. And the fire that destroyed it all was lit by someone who decided profit mattered more than preservation. This isn't a lost wonder. This is evidence. Evidence of how we treat labor. Evidence of how we value history. Evidence of what happens when obsession builds monuments and greed burns them down. The Pacific Ocean didn't destroy the Sutro Baths. People did. Sutro, with his compulsion to control nature. The heirs, with their incompetence and neglect. The Whitney family, with their suspicious fire and insurance payout. And all of us, with our comfortable amnesia. But the evidence remains. In concrete, in iron, in archives at San Francisco State University, in the tunnels that still descend into the rock, in the pump chambers that still echo with the sound of waves. The ocean has been cleaning this crime scene for 58 years, removing the ash, exposing the truth, waiting for someone to investigate. When you came to Land's End asking how could something so massive disappear so completely, you were asking the wrong question. The right question is, who wanted it gone? And now you know the answer. Everyone who valued money more than memory. Everyone who chose profit over preservation. Everyone who forgot that architecture isn't just about the person who designed it. It's about the people who built it. The Sutro Baths didn't disappear. They were erased. Deliberately, methodically, profitably. But erasure isn't the same as destruction. The ruins remain. The evidence remains. The story remains. You just have to be willing to investigate instead of romanticize, to examine instead of admire, to remember the workers alongside the visionary. The Sutro Baths aren't a tragedy. They're a testimony to obsession, to exploitation, to greed, and to the ocean's patient, relentless victory over all of it. The glass palace is gone, but the truth is still standing, right there in the ruins. If you know how to look. So what does this investigation reveal? What do you learn when you treat history as evidence rather than nostalgia? When you follow the money instead of the romance? When you examine what was built, who built it, and why someone wanted it gone?